This flipped video is going to cover a series of dates and events that are important for this unit. You do not necessarily have to know every single individual date, but the general order of these events is very important, and it is also important that you understand the various different reactions of the Catholic Church during this time period. You do not have notes that go along with this video. You do, however, have posted into Edmodo a series of questions that you're going to need to answer. So, the first person that you need to know for the Protestant Reformation is John Wycliffe. John Wycliffe was an Englishman who was very, very famous for being one of the very first people to take the Bible and translate parts of it into English. We talked about translating things into the vernacular earlier in our unit. We talked about how the Bible was originally published only in Latin, and it made it very difficult because if you hadn't studied Latin, you weren't actually going to be able to read the Bible. And when Wycliffe translates it into English, it helps to promote more people being able to read the Bible. Shortly thereafter, John Huss was excommunicated, which means he was kicked out of the Catholic Church because he was speaking out against indulgences. Remember, we talked about those indulgences as being things that were essentially get-out-of-hell-free cards for the Catholic Church to make money. Okay. So after several decades pass, there are still a lot of other issues going on in the Catholic Church. The indulgences are happening even though Huss talks about it. There's a lot of corruption within the church, and so Martin Luther is in Germany, and he puts together this list. He puts together a list of 95 complaints, 95 things that he thought the Catholic Church was doing wrong, and he posts them publicly on a door in a church in Germany. His hope is that he was going to cause reform within the church itself, and basically what he does is he causes a bunch of other people to break away from the Catholic Church. Several years later, there's a conference in Germany that deals with what they're going to do about Luther and basically decides that if Luther's going to speak out against the church, they were going to excommunicate him. He also takes time to translate the Bible into German, similarly to how we've talked about the Bible being translated out of Latin into English. Luther is the one involved in translating it into German. In 1526, it is again translated into English. It's translated several times into English, like the King James Version of the Bible is a translation done by King James in the 1600s about the translations and how they change the wordings every time you translate it. So that's why that comes up again. There's also an Augsburg Confession where Martin Luther details out his beliefs and why he stood for the things that he stood for. And as a result, they are called the Augsburg Confessions, and he basically puts in place the teachings of the Lutheran Church. 1533, we have King Henry VIII, and King Henry VIII is the king in England who is trying to make sure that he protects his family line and he protects his monarchy. And in order to do so, he needed to have a son. And unfortunately, they had a really sad life, and they'd had several children die and several miscarriages. It was really sort of depressing. And so he has an issue where his wife, Catherine, is too old to have children. And so he asks the Pope if he could have an annulment, which is basically an erasing of your marriage. It says that your marriage isn't valid. And because they'd already had several children, it was very clear that their marriage was long and at least relatively significant, and so the Pope was like, no, you can't have an annulment, like you can't get divorced, we're Catholic, we don't do that. And so instead what he decides is that he's just going to make his own church, and he issues what's called the Act of Supremacy, and within that he says that the king has more power than the Pope. And so, since he's the King of England, he gets to do whatever he wants, and he divorces people, and that's how he ends up with 6 wives, all in the struggle to have a son. There's another man called Ignatius of Loyola, and he's a monk who creates what's called the Society of Jesus. And basically what that is a missionary group, but it's a Catholic missionary group, and that missionary group puts together all sorts of different things, including they're going to go to the New World and create schools, but they are basically an attempt within the Catholic Church to promote Catholic traditions. John Calvin is going to be one of the successors to Martin Luther, and he writes a lot about predestination, this belief that every action in your life has already been set into place. God knows exactly what's going to happen to you, despite your ability to rationalize. God knows choices you're going to make. And that becomes a very big separation between a lot of different religious sects in the current theology. Shortly thereafter, there's something called the Council of Trent that is held, and that is a meeting amongst Catholic leaders in which they're going to deal with all these issues. Like, they're basically trying to take the 95 Theses and the teachings of Luther and the teachings of John Calvin and decide what changes need to be made in order to keep people from breaking apart from the Catholic Church. And so the Council of Trent is, 20 years long almost, and basically does no changes to the church except for really, really minute ones. And, for instance, like, tries to get rid of indulgences and that sort of thing. So there is something called the Peace of Augsburg. And the Peace of Augsburg takes place in the Holy Roman Empire, which is not Roman, and it's not guided really by the Pope anymore, but it's a country in the middle of Europe, sort of where Germany is. It's sort of what Germany is for a while. And it is dealing with freedom of religion, and basically says that within the Holy Roman Empire, which has several different kingdoms within it, because it's an empire, so there's several different areas that are all encompassed in the same governmental system, they will be able to have Protestants and Catholics living in the same place and not killing each other. In 1598, the French issue what's called the Edict of Nantes, which is one of your vocabulary words. And the Edict of Nantes is issued in France and says, hey, don't kill people for being Protestant. There's a group of people in France called the Huguenots, and the Huguenots were Protestant French citizens living in a Catholic country. And up until 1598, it was 100% logical and possible for the French Protestant Huguenots to be killed simply for not being Catholic. And so the King of France basically was like, hey, that's probably a problem, so they take that off. And they say, don't do that, be religious, allow for freedom of religion. So this is the very beginnings of freedom of religion 200 years before the American Bill of Rights gives us freedom of religion. A little bit later, Cardinal Richelieu, who was a French cardinal who's within the French government, brings France into the 30 Years' War. Now, the 30 Years' War was being fought within the Holy Roman Empire, and it was fought on several stages, mostly over Catholic versus Protestant control of Central and Southern Europe. France is concerned about a couple of things. One, that Spain has allied with the Catholic Church, and so Spain and France had fought some wars, and France had lost some of their territory. So they were like, hey, if we fight against Spain and we win, maybe we'll get some of our land back. And they were also concerned that the Holy Roman Empire was building and growing, and they didn't want to lose part of their country to the Holy Roman Empire either and become an even smaller country. So they ally as a Catholic country with the Protestants in the 30 Years' War. So instead of having Protestants versus Catholics, it's now France and the Holy Roman Protestants versus Spain, sort of the papacy, and the Holy Roman Catholics. And so it's no longer just a Protestants-Catholics war, because you have Catholics fighting Catholics when France joins against Spain. So it changes the war from a religious war to a political one. In 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia ends the war, and look at all these groups that are inside of this war. It's several countries: Holy Roman Empire, Austria, Spain, France, Sweden, and the Netherlands. Those are huge areas all involved in this war. It is decades of bloody warfare that began over religion and religious control of the government. So there you have it. We went quickly through a lot of major events. There's a lot of vocabulary in this. So a couple of things you're going to want to do. A, you need to go on back into Edmodo. There's a link to a Google Doc. You have to answer the questions in order to get credit for watching the video. B, if you want to rewatch the video for any words that you didn't understand, you're going to look for those in your World History 2.3 vocabulary in Quizlet or in your Reformation packet. If you have any questions, email me. or send me a message in Emoto or tweet me or whatever.